Hi, I'm Wayne Bruce, and this is the Meaning Mission, where my mission is to help people like you know Yahweh God in all his creation. There's a few good reasons for this. For one, we are promised in both Habakkuk 2:14 and Isaiah 11:9 that the knowledge of Yahweh will fill the earth as the water covers the sea. Furthermore, when Jesus is praying to the Father in John 17:3, he says, "This is eternal life, that they know you, the one true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent." So, with these things in mind, it seems worth looking into knowing God in every way that we can. And that's the purpose of this channel. That's the purpose of all the ministry that I am involved with. So, particularly today, we want to look at this question: is Jesus God? Because this is obviously going to be very important to knowing God, is knowing, okay, well, is Jesus God or not? Right? And this is a question that has been on everyone's mind for about the last 2,000 years or so. So obviously, I'm going to be able to answer it today in just a few minutes, right? Not for everyone, but we're going to take our best shot at it. We're going to take a good look. So, this, by the way, in the background, Stories of Life and Passion of Christ by Gadenzo Ferrari, 1513. Probably saying that wrong. Anyhow, I just pulled this off of Wikipedia. It said it was public domain, so there you go. Now, the question is Jesus God? Obviously, why am I asking, right? Besides the fact that it's a popular question. Well, a few years ago, a friend close to me challenged me about this, and he did not believe that Jesus is God. And I was raised believing Jesus is God, but I realized I couldn't articulate it. And that made me very uncomfortable with my faith because if I am living up to the great command that we'll talk about here in a little bit, and if I am trying to know God, then I should know if Jesus is God. And so I wasn't comfortable with my faith, and I went on a more serious journey since then. And so I want to help some of you maybe go through that type of journey if that is something that you're needing in your life. But as we do this, we realize we have to ask, well, what does that even mean? Right? What does it mean for Jesus to be God? Because, well, obviously, Jesus is on earth while God is in heaven and he's speaking to him and speaking of him. And a voice from heaven speaks in relation to Jesus and it's separate. So, what is going on? Right? Um, and what obviously we're asking is not just, is Jesus God or is Jesus divine, but more specifically, is Jesus Yahweh? Right? And further, we may even ask, is Yahweh a man? So this is part one of a two-part series. And first, we're going to look at evidence in the Tanakh, right? And I'll talk about what that means here in a minute. So when we read the great command that I've referenced, it starts like this: Hear, Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. And you should love Yahweh your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And you should love your neighbor as yourself. So it may be natural upon hearing this to think, well, obviously, if Yahweh is one and Yahweh is God and there is no other, and Jesus is at some point on earth and he speaks to God, then he can't be Yahweh. So they should be separate. He can't, that doesn't even make sense to ask. But at the same time, we may have to ask, well, why is it even important to say that Yahweh is one, right? Doesn't that seem kind of obvious that Wayne is one? Well, okay, I'm one person, but like, what does that mean to say that, right? So if we're gonna consider this book called the Bible to be worth reading, then it should be either very clear that yes, Yahweh is one, and there's only one person of Yahweh, and that's it. Or there should be a complicated picture that comes into view that shows why such a statement is necessary in the first place. Because again, it just doesn't seem worth saying that a person is one unless there's something bigger going on than we really have the capacity, to process, quite simply. So, in order to investigate this, we're going to look at Tanakh scriptures, which Tanakh means the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, right? So that's the Hebrew ordering of the Old Testament. I find it to be the most useful way to read my Old Testament. The Torah being the first five books, also called the Pentateuch, right? So the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. followed, by Joshua, the start of the former prophets, goes on from there, and then the Ketuvim, the writings, as last, starts with Psalms and actually ends with Chronicles. So um, go look up what the Tanakh order is. I highly recommend that. I highly recommend you read it in that order. It is much easier, in my opinion, because I always get bogged down otherwise. Anyway, so we're going to specifically look through the Tanakh and form of an investigation to see where Yahweh God seems to manifest, right, in a visible form, and see what does this say about his divine nature, whether, directly, implicitly, or overtly, right? So as we're doing this, obviously there is an agenda, right? So this is the investigation uh, to analyze textual data and see first, does Yahweh God appear as a human in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament, right? And then further, when he does, if he does it support that Yahweh God exists simultaneously as multiple persons, right? For lack of a better term. So this is what our goal is today. And with many investigations, with this type of investigation, there are three possible outcomes for these specific questions. All right. First, it could be inconclusive. Maybe the evidence fails to give us a confident outcome about the claim, right? Maybe we can't say for sure either way. Maybe it's so unclear, I don't even know what's going on. That could be the case. It could be unsubstantiated. We may find that the evidence fails to not only fails to support the claim, but leads us to confidently deny the claim and say, no, Yahweh is one. There is only one person of Yahweh. So Jesus can't be Yahweh because Yahweh is still in heaven when Jesus is on earth. Maybe that's what's going on here, right? And that's why we're looking at the Old Testament first, because we have to set up a basis for what is in the New Testament. Finally, it could be substantiated. Maybe uh, this investigation will show us that Yahweh God does appear as a human while simultaneously existing separate from that appearance as a human. All right. So these are the three possible outcomes we can arrive at based on the investigation. Now, if it is substantiated that Yahweh appears as a human while existing outside of that exact form in a way that implies multiple personhood, if you will, then we're going to investigate whether Jesus Christ is the distinct human person of Yahweh by examination of the New Testament scripture. And that's why a title for this may be, Is Yahweh a Man? So, as with any investigation, there are several barriers that we need to consider, right? And these are all going to be tied together to some degree. And I'm going to do my best to overcome them. I'm going to do my best to name the barrier when it comes up as we're investigating. I'll say, hey, this is, where this specific barrier comes into play. So, for example, I'm going to have an implicit bias, right? Can't help that because I have a history, just like you, just like anyone. I have a background of beliefs. Now, I was raised in a, you know, American Christian Church of Christ household and church context and tradition. But ironically, from that, I grew a big distaste for this because I said so and believe what I believe because I told you to and don't ask questions. I've always had a big problem with that. And so I think that's going to help us here that while I do have an implicit bias, I also have a sort of a bias to not believe just what I'm told just because I'm told it. All right. And that's what I think helps to make me a good investigator, which brings us to our second point. I am a bit of a layman here, right? So I am not a textual critic. I am not trained theologically. All of my theological knowledge really comes from free resources, and I'll show you what some of those are as we go. I spend a lot of time listening to different people with different perspectives to help me gain a strong theological footing. But again, I'm not an expert on the language. I can't read biblical Hebrew or any Hebrew for that matter or Greek. I can use some free resources that help overcome that. And so we're going to do, what we can to overcome that. But again, I am not a scholar in any sense of the term. I have a degree in criminal justice. All right. And I have a professional career as an investigator and as an analyst. So I do think that those skills will be very beneficial to us in this investigation and this analysis, if you will, of the scriptural textual data, right? So again, I'm not a scholar, but I do bring some skills to the table that are going to serve us well. Now, context is obviously very important, and my ability to totally account for that, partly because I am a layman, partly because I only have such a limited capacity to know things and to look into things, all right, is going to be limited to some degree. And it would be for anyone. Even the most astute scholar would not be able to totally get into the exact context because we're coming at this from so many years down the road. All right. So we're going to do our best to overcome that. But know as well that, the author's intent may not necessarily be what we want it to be, right? So they may not be looking to answer the questions that I bring to the text because they're coming from my context. They're coming from 2,000 years down the road. Maybe the questions that I'm asking don't even make sense to them. And maybe it's just seems silly if you were the people living at this time, I say 2,000 years. That's, just to the New Testament, of course. Um, yeah, so it's not obvious that they're trying to answer exactly the questions I'm trying to ask. Now, a question like this, I do think would be something we can gain an answer to by looking, but that may not be the main thing they're wanting to communicate. And that needs to be okay with us. All right. So finally, ambiguous language, right? So just like with any language, if you speak a language, and I assume you do, or read one or something, then you know that many words don't have just one meaning. You can use a word or a phrase for multiple different meanings. I don't think I need to give examples here. If you speak English, especially, or read English, then you know that sometimes you have to be careful about which use of a word is in play here, right? And just knowing the context again can help overcome that. But if you're not, embedded in the culture and the language, it may not be as obvious. All right. So these are the things that we're going to try to overcome as we go. I'm going to point these out. But with that, let's go ahead and hop on into the start of Genesis. Thank you so much for going on this journey with me. All right, so starting in Genesis 1 and just looking for times when Yahweh manifests in what may be a visible presence, we're going to take a look first at Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, when it says, the Ruach, or the Spirit of God, hovered over the waters before God began speaking to create the earth, right? So we're going to pull up several verses. I'm not going to pull up every verse that I've referenced just for the sake of time. I hope that's okay with you guys. But I do, want to really focus in on the ones that I think are most impactful to this investigation. So, this one is one that's probably pretty familiar to you, that the Spirit or the Ruach of God hovered over the waters. All right. So we don't know exactly what that would have looked like with a video camera, but just first mention of some kind of a manifestation. Secondly, we have in Genesis 1:26, God is speaking possibly in the plural about himself, saying, "Let us make mankind in our image according to our likeness." Right? Again, that's Genesis 1:26. Now, it's not necessary that this is Yahweh God speaking in the plural about himself. Some people have that view. Some would instead say that this is language referring to the divine council, right? Other spiritual beings who were present at creation, according to Job 38:7, right? So if you want to know more about divine council, go look into Daniel 4, go look at 1 Kings 22. There's a lot in that subject. We're not going to get into that today. So for the time, I think we can let this go either way. I don't think this really needs to make or break our investigation in any way. But I just wanted to name it because it may be telling us something, and it may not. Now, when creating the man from dust in Genesis 2:7, we know that Yahweh breathed into his nostrils the breath or the nephesh of life. Right. So it seems like this is written in a way to indicate that he is physically present, breathing into a physically present human, right? You can otherwise interpret it if you really want to. Again, that's going to be where your own implicit bias is going to come into play, right? And we're going to see a lot of those instances again where, depending on what our biases are, we're going to be given to a certain understanding, which may or may not be what the author intended. So, moving on, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 8, after the sin of Adam and Eve, it said that Yahweh God is walking in the garden in the Ruach of the day. Big rabbit hole we're going to sidestep for now. But see this word here, halach, and we can actually bring this word up in our step Bible, and I'll put it on the screen here uh, for you guys in just a second. Um, so this word, halach, um, can be used for something flowing, right? The river is flowing. Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God, right? Yahweh God was walking. So this word is not given only to the interpretation of a human walking. It can mean that, and that might be what the author is intending to convey here. But it's not 100% necessary that that's what's going on. So we'll keep going and see what we think is going on as we continue to gather evidence from Scripture. So, moving on, God does appear to Abraham on multiple occasions. All right. So many of you may be familiar with this, many of you may not, but even those who are familiar may find some very interesting details that's going to lay the groundwork for really the rest of this two-part series. So I want you to pay special attention to especially the early part of this video because that's where I think the best investigative evidence comes from Scripture is going to be from these chapters of the Torah, right? Um, I think everything is pretty well centered on the Torah as far as this investigation is going to go. So again, I cannot stress enough that there's useful, important things in other parts for sure, 100%. But just in my review of the data in my investigation, it looks like the Torah is where most of the groundwork is going to be laid for everything that happens later, and it makes sense, right? Because there are just like with our cultures today, there are different Christians who believe a different set of canon, right? Whether you're Catholic or whether you're maybe of the tradition that I'm from, right, as a Protestant, or maybe you're, from some other country that has some other biblical canon, right? So this is not a new problem. And one thing that's core to pretty much everyone is belief in the Torah. So it would make sense that the most important things are spelled out most clearly in the Torah, right? And everything kind of builds off of that. All right. So without further ado, let's get into Abraham. All right. So, Yahweh first appeared to Abraham in Genesis 12, and no specifics are given, right? It just says that Yahweh appeared to Abraham, okay? So, what's interesting though is that in Genesis 15, we have two interesting accounts, and we're going to pull this one up. We're going to spend a little bit of time interacting with this text, all right? So, if we look here at Genesis 15, we see that in verse 1, it says, The word of Yahweh came to Abraham in a vision, okay? So, this is the first mention of the word of Yahweh being something visible, right? So what is going on there? Again, is there elasticity in this term where this doesn't have to mean something seen? Uh, if that's the case, I don't know why they're using vision to translate it. Again, I'm not a scholar. There's only so far down the rabbit holes I can really trace this. But just from seeing this, it says the word of Yahweh came to Abraham in a vision, something visible, but said, "Do not fear, Abraham. I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great." Okay. Now, this idea of Yahweh being a shield, of Yahweh saying, "Do not fear," of Yahweh promising a reward, these are things that are going to be common throughout Scripture, especially in the Psalms, right? Psalm 34, right, is a good example. So go look that up if you'd like some extra reading assignment. We're not going to get too much into that, but if we go on down a little bit further, we're going to see in verse 17 where something else is said, right? So let's see, scrolling down here. It came about when the sun had set, it was very dark, and behold, a smoking oven and a flaming torch appeared, which passed between these pieces. Now, in the context here, of course, this is when a covenant is being made between Yahweh God and Abraham, all right? And what happens is that Yahweh made a covenant with Abraham, and he makes this promise again. But what's going on in this ceremony is that there is a smoking oven and a flaming torch, right? And when you think about this sort of symbol, you can think about two things obviously come to mind is fire and some kind of smoke or cloud, right? And that's what passes, through the parts of, what's been cut up here, these animals, and this is how the covenant is made, right? Now, we're not going to get into talking about ancient covenants and how strange it is to us in the year 2025 and so on, to hear about, these animals being cut in half. And that's how you make a covenant, is you pass between them. And the fact that, you know, Yahweh is apparently making the covenant by going between them, but in the form of a smoking oven and a flaming torch, right? So we have this idea of fire and of smoke. Okay. So that's gonna again lay some groundwork for the future. All right. So let's keep on trucking here. And again, it's not specific to how Yahweh appeared to Abraham in Genesis 17, but he does appear again to Abraham. All right. In Genesis 18, we do have a little bit more specifics as to what is going on. All right. And we're going to pull up the text here, and I'm, kind of showing my hand what I think about this, but I'm going to put it on your screen once again, and we'll just take a look. So it says, Yahweh appeared, again, that word appeared, something visible, to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, all right, which, that's probably a rabbit hole. Go check out Bible Project. They have a lot of thoughts about oaks of Mamre, right? But while he was sitting at the tent door in the heat of the day, right? And when he raised his eyes and looked, behold, three men were standing opposite him. So Yahweh appeared, but who appeared was three men. Okay? So is Yahweh three men, or is Yahweh one of the three men? What exactly is going on here? Right? So he says, My Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by. Right? So he wants to provide service, and he calls him his Lord, or he says his Lord, and it's to these three men. And the text told us that it was Yahweh who had appeared. All right. So it's a little bit unclear, and I think intentionally so, what is going on here. But as we continue to scroll down, if we were to read through all this, again, we don't have time to read every word of every passage we're bringing up, but I do recommend you doing so in your own time. This is, as much as anything, an overview of the investigation that I've done. Um, Yahweh is making a promise to him, right? The men rose up and looked towards Sodom, and Abraham was walking with them to send them off. Yahweh said, Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Since Abraham will certainly become great and a mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed. For I have chosen him, right? And he goes on. So this is Yahweh is speaking, but it seems like it must be one, if not all three, of the men are representing Yahweh here. But as we go on, it says, I will go to see, right? Then the men turned away from there and went towards Sodom while Abraham was still standing before Yahweh. All right, so what is going on? Did two of the men leave? And what does it mean that Abraham was still standing before Yahweh when the men departed, right? And went. And so this is, I think, maybe the beginning of a little bit of a riddle, if you will, that's going to continue throughout Scripture. So this is where, of course, Abraham appeals and wants to save Sodom, but ultimately, he settles for, okay, well, 10 righteous need to be found, and we know 10 righteous were not found. Now, what's interesting is there were three men, right? Abraham is standing before Yahweh. The men continue on. But if we go on to the next chapter, to Genesis 19, now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, all right? And so I think this is indication that of the three humans, this is my interpretation, my understanding of what's happening is that Yahweh apparently is one of the humans that appeared there, but the two others are angels. That's just my reading from the text, what I am understanding to have happened here, based on Yahweh appeared and his three men appearing. The men continue on, and then we see that two angels came, but Abraham was still standing before Yahweh. All right, so that's the only way I can make sense of the text. If you have another interpretation, please let me know. I did want to back up. I do think it's interesting if you look in verse 19 here, Yahweh is speaking to Abraham. He says, "For I have chosen him so that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of Yahweh by doing righteousness and justice, so that Yahweh may bring upon." Right? Why does he not say so that I? Why does he say so that Yahweh? He speaks, it seems like, in the third person, yet about himself. All right, so I think this is really complicated. I don't think I'm able to fully understand it. I don't know to what degree it would have been normal for someone to speak in the third person about themselves, but I just think it's interesting because he speaks of himself in the first person and in the third person. And so it's this sort of back and forth. Why would Yahweh be speaking in the first person and in the third person within the same speech? That seems strange to me. I can understand if it's a thing for someone to speak in the third person about themselves and it's sort of this idea of majesty or whatever may come from that. But when it's a back and forth like that, I just think that complicates things. I don't understand why you would do that unless there's something going on we don't understand. So that is Yahweh appearing to Abraham. But if we go on, Yahweh also appeared to Hagar, right? The immigrant who was the servant, the slave of Abraham and Sarai. Okay. And this occurs in Genesis chapter 16, verses 7 through 13. All right. So this is very important to understanding what's going on in the rest of Scripture. This particular story is something that gets built upon in the rest of Scripture. All right. So for that reason, we are going to spend again some time here. All right, looking into this. So it was the angel of Yahweh who found her by a spring of water and spoke to her. And the angel of Yahweh said, I will greatly multiply, but also speaks of Yahweh in the third person, saying, Yahweh has heard, right? So again, just like when Yahweh appeared to Abraham, now when the angel of Yahweh appears to Hagar, it's both I and Yahweh as a third person, all right? And now, if there's any doubt, verse 13 does clarify, but I am not going to just brush over this. I want to put this on your screen here so that we can take a look at it together. So, again, the angel of Yahweh, right? So again, this word angel does mean messenger. Okay. So that is important to know. This messenger, maybe this is some other messenger, right? It's not at first clear. Is this some secondary angel or messenger that Yahweh sent? But it says the messenger, the angel of Yahweh found her by a spring of water on on her way to some place I probably can't pronounce well. Um, and so, from where you come from, where are you going, right? And s- they have this conversation, and the angel of Yahweh, the messenger of Yahweh, said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count. The angel of Yahweh said to her further, Behold, you are pregnant, right? And tells her about this because Yahweh has heard your affliction, right? I will multiply. Yahweh has heard. Okay. And it goes on and it says, Then she called the name of Yahweh who spoke to her, right? So it was Yahweh speaking to her. It seems that this is Yahweh speaking to her, whether that means one thing or another, right? When we say the angel appeared, but it was Yahweh speaking, did the angel open his mouth, but it was Yahweh speaking from heaven through the angel's mouth? Or was it this angel is actually Yahweh, similar to when, Abraham had Yahweh appear to him, but it was three men, right? So what is going on here? Um, what can we do to understand this? I think it's difficult. I know some people will say, well, this is a way that, a messenger will speak in the first person because they're speaking with the authority of who sent them. That may be the case. I have a hard time reconciling that, especially when it's this back and forth, first and third person. I just think that seems odd. I don't quite find that convincing to me, especially considering it says you are a God who sees me, for she said, I have seen him here and lived after he saw me, right? So she seems to think that she saw Yahweh God and she is shocked that she's still alive, right? And so we're going to talk about a passage in Exodus that explains that. If it's not clear to you, like, well, why should you be shocked by that? But it seems like she doesn't think that she should be able to live after Yahweh has seen her. And I just realized my margin isn't in the right place there. So let me fix that for you guys. Sorry about that. So yeah, so you are a God who sees me. Okay. So I think that is immensely fascinating. And in fact, I am a little bit surprised I didn't put verse 14 in here, but we can fix this right quick. Let's see. All we have to do is arrow forward, it goes to 17, arrow back, gives us all of 16. And if you look at verse 14, she called the well Bir Lahiroi. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Um, and if you highlight over it, it says, let's see, what does it say this means? Well, it tells us about a well, and oh, I have to go on this. It says, the well of the living one who sees me. Okay. So she is saying that this angel of Yahweh is the living one, and he sees her, and she is shocked that she is living after Yahweh has seen her and spoke to her. Okay. So it appears to Hagar that this is Yahweh appearing as a messenger, right? Whether that means what we would consider an angelic being, or whether this means some other kind of messenger, right? It's not immensely clear from the text. Something is going on here. And I think it is similar to what is going on with Abraham. So we're going to continue on with our investigation. All right. So thank you, Hagar, for that. Now, Yahweh also appeared to Jacob. All right. And this first seems to happen during a dream. In Genesis 28:10 through 17, he said he saw Yahweh standing or stationed. Again, that word that's being used there is not necessarily specific to a human stance, but on top of a ladder or staircase, depending on how you interpret that, where angels were moving between heaven and earth. Okay. So Yahweh is on top of a ladder, right? He sees Yahweh up there. Um, and then he recounts another dream later on where he says, the angel of God spoke to him and called himself the God of Bethel, to whom Jacob had vowed, right? So when Jacob had seen Yahweh standing on there, he had afterwards made a vow that he would be his God. Now it was, if such and such, such and such. We won't get into all that. However, I think that's very interesting. So he says this angel of God is the God of Bethel, right? Which means house of God, right? To whom Jacob vowed. And obviously, Jacob had made his vow to Yahweh, right? Now, when preparing to meet his brother Esau, this is a very famous story. You probably know this, even if you don't know the others. He is alone at camp when a man, quote unquote, wrestles with him. But it's implied and it's stated that it was God whom he wrestled with. Though, this term Elohim can lack specificity, right? This idea of Elohim can mean other kinds of divine beings or spirits or even human spirits. So again, another rabbit hole there. So, is this saying necessarily Yahweh God? Um, and we know that there was at least one or more angels of God there, but it doesn't require that this is the same angel of Yahweh which Hagar met. That is certainly plausible, and I think it is likely, but it is not the only necessary interpretation. Okay, so we're gonna keep this in mind, but what's important to know is that Jacob, just like Abraham and just like Hagar, apparently saw Yahweh in some form, okay? And he was standing or stationed. And this is also called the angel of God, the God of Bethel, right? The God whom he had made a vow to, who is Yahweh God, okay? And he wrestled with God, okay? And this is going to get referenced later, and it's going to clarify that this is apparently Yahweh God who he wrestled with, not some lesser, divine being that was sent. Again, unless you really stretch our interpretation, but we will circle back to that when it appears. So for now, we're going to move on to the Exodus. All right. The Exodus is maybe even the most critical book of our study here. So in Exodus 3, the angel of Yahweh appeared to Moses in a fire in a bush. Okay. So you probably are familiar with this. This is when Yahweh calls Moses into service. And it says, the angel of Yahweh appeared to him in a blazing fire in the midst of a bush. And looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not being consumed. Okay? When Yahweh saw he had turned aside to look, God called to him from the middle or the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. He said, here I am. Do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Okay? So this is the angel of Yahweh appearing in a bush saying, I am God. I am the God of your father. But I thought this was just the angel. I thought this was just the messenger. Well, apparently that's not so different, according to just a plain reading of this text, which says it was the angel of Yahweh which appeared in the bush. But then it says God called to him, right? Elohim called to him and says, I am the God of your father. Okay. So I think that is quite fascinating, to say the least, for terms of our investigation. All right. And we talked about this. So now, further, when Moses does finally comply and leads the Israelites out of Egypt, it says that Yahweh went before them in a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Now, these passages are all really important, so we're going to bring up each one of those here in just a moment. See if I can get this arranged for you all. All right, so and Yahweh was going before them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them. Okay, so again, we have this idea of Yahweh and cloud and fire, right? Remember, that was the first well described, you can call it well prescribed, described appearance to Abraham. We had the oven and the torch, right? So again, the smoke and the fire, or the cloud and the fire. It's the same type of imagery. And this is what's going around the nation of Israel, the Hebrews, as they are being brought up out of Egypt. Okay. So this is apparently how Yahweh appears. And then in Exodus 14, 19, and 20, it says, the angel of Yahweh who had been going before. So wait, was it Yahweh or was it the angel of Yahweh? Again, it doesn't look like there's a difference, just on a plain reading of the text. Now, if I'm misunderstanding this, please help me to understand it. But it looks like, okay, the angel of God had been going before them, and the pillar of cloud moved before them and stood behind them. All right, so again, the cloud, the fire, right? Gave light at night, gave shade during the day. And then in 1424, the morning watch, Yahweh looked down on the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud and brought the army of Egyptians into confusion. So again, this this had said it was Yahweh in the fire and in the cloud, right? Then it says the angel of God was going before them and is identified with the cloud, all right, with the pillar. But then again, after that, it says Yahweh looked down. So it seems like they would have needed to do a better job if they didn't want it to look like this angel of God, angel of Yahweh is Yahweh. All right. Now, let's go back to our PowerPoint here. So, multiple times through the Exodus scene, it said that Yahweh is the one fighting for Israel. Now, this is, of course, affirmed in the victory song that follows, but I just really want to look at a specific statement in 15:3, which says, Yahweh is a warrior, Yahweh is his name. Okay, and put that on the screen right quick. Exodus 15:3, Yahweh is a warrior, Yahweh is his name. Okay, Yahweh is the one fighting for them, right? And so it seems like, you know, in our context, we may want to say, well, in some far off sense, he's fighting for them, in some indirect sense. But it seems like, just on a plain reading, no, they actually believe he is visibly, physically present. He is the one in the cloud. He is the one in the fire. He is the one fighting for them. All right. He is a warrior. Yahweh is his name. And that's something that, again, it can seem like this is a metaphor, but I don't think it is. We're going to look at a later text here in just a little bit that's going to clarify what I think is going on here. But let's just put a pin in that for now. This idea Yahweh is a warrior, Yahweh is his name. Now, we have several more appearances that bear mention in Exodus. So, immediately after Moses gets the law on Mount Sinai, he is told by Yahweh that he will send an angel which has Yahweh's name to guard them. Right. So, does that mean simply that this angel has a divine prerogative? Does that just mean that this angel is someone that God has elected to do it? Is that all that's meant by the name, or does that mean that it bears the same identity, that this angel also is Yahweh? And we have to remember, we've already seen a context for this angel potentially being Yahweh, because it was the angel of Yahweh which appeared to Hagar, but she was convinced that wasn't just some angel representing Yahweh, but she seemed convinced it was Yahweh himself. Furthermore, in the burning bush, the angel of Yahweh, but then knows the angel of Yahweh says, I am the God of your fathers. So it is interesting that they are instructed by Yahweh in reference to this angel to obey his voice and do all that I say. Okay. So we can pull that up and show you what I'm talking about. So behold, I'm going to send an angel before you. Be attentive to him and obey his voice. Do not be rebellious, for he will not pardon your rebellion, since my name is in him. But if you truly obey his voice and do all that I say. So, does that only mean that by listening to the voice of the angel, they are listening to God because God has given them the authority to speak on his behalf? Or does that mean that God is more directly speaking through him? Or does that mean that the angel is Yahweh in the same sense that the angel is Yahweh for Hagar and for Moses? And I think that's potentially open to some interpretation here. And I know this is something that different people will point to and say, see, this is evidence that, Jesus is only hearing the divine name in this kind of sense of, well, he has the prerogative, he is um, going to have the authority to forgive sins, to give commands based on, Yahweh giving him that authority. And that could be the case. However, I am not 100% convinced of that perspective. It seems to me, again, this is just, my understanding. It seems to me like something deeper is going on here. Okay. Again, obey his voice and do all that I say. And if we go back to the Garden of Eden, we know how important it was to listen to Yahweh's voice, to do what he says, but instead, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, right? So you were supposed to listen to Yahweh's voice, and Yahweh's voice is in this angel. Again, it could be that that is meant indirectly or metaphorically. It could be that that is meant directly and exactly. It's impossible to 100% say one way or the other just from reading this text, in my opinion. However, if we look at the total context, I think we'll get a more clear idea. Again, we all have our biases, we all have our barriers, so we're going to do our best. But let's just keep this in mind as we continue on here. So, um, furthermore, in verse 25, Yahweh again either refers to himself directly in the third person or reference the angel as the one who will bless them. So we're going to pull this back up here. And if you look in 25 there at the bottom of your screen, it says, you shall serve Yahweh your God, and he will bless your bread and your water, and I will remove sickness from your midst. Right? So again, why is Yahweh speaking in both the first and the third person in the same sentence? This just seems strange to me. Now, maybe this is a normal way that they would expect God to communicate. Maybe this is a normal way that a divine figure or a king would communicate, is saying, "You shall serve Yahweh, and I will do this." But I don't know what to make of this exactly, right? So it's a little bit of a head scratcher to me. Um, but maybe someone out there watching this is jumping up and down, thinking, "Wayne, you're an idiot. It means this. This is common, or etc." Hey, let me know. Drop a comment, please. I want to learn. So, anyhow, moving on. In Exodus 24:17, we have another appearance of Yahweh's glory with cloud and fire, right? Those same symbols, they're going to keep popping up again and again and again. Exodus 33 bears particularly important information for us. Right after the golden calf incident, Yahweh tells Moses that he will not go among the people, but will send his angel ahead of them. Okay, so let's go ahead and put that on your screen. Yahweh spoke to Moses, "Depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought up from the land of Egypt to the promised land," right? "And I will send an angel before you." So is this the angel of Yahweh? Is this Yahweh himself, or is this some other angel or messenger, right? It's that same Malach messenger. "And I will drive out," right? So is that he's driving out by this other angel that isn't him, or is that he is driving out by himself, who is the angel? that's debatable. But it says, "Go up to this promised land, for I will not go up in your midst, because you are an obstinate people, and I might destroy you on the way." And of course, this last part is reminiscent of when Moses is called by Yahweh, and then Yahweh apparently attempts to kill him, and then there's this strange circumcision story. And so there's a big rabbit hole there, but I think this is a good tie-in to that if that is a subject you are studying or interested in studying. However, for today, I think that what's going on here is whether or not this is the angel of Yahweh, whether or not it is an angel who also is Yahweh, it seems like the difference is that the angel will go before you, right? Instead of in the midst. Okay. So I think that's what's going on. But now, if we scroll down to verse 12, if we're confused and if we want to really say, okay, well, is this angel Yahweh or not? Moses says to Yahweh, "See, you say to me, 'Bring up this people,' but you yourself have not let me know whom you will send with me." Right? So he apparently doesn't know who the angel is. It's like you're sending some messenger, some angel, but I don't know who. Moreover, you have said, "I've known you by name. You have found favor in my sight." Now, if I have found favor in your sight in any way, please let me know your ways so that I may know you. Right? That's what we're after here. In order that I might find favor in your sight. Consider this too, that this nation is your people. And he said, apparently Yahweh, "My presence shall go with you, and I will give you rest," right, in the promised land. And he said to him, "If your presence does not go with us, do not lead us up from here." Okay, this word presence, pene, is going to be very important. "For how then can it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not by your going with us, so that we, I and your people, may be distinguished from all the other people who are on the face of the earth?" And Yahweh affirms again, "I will also do this thing of which you have spoken, for you have found favor in my sight, and I have known you by name." And Moses said, "Please show me your glory." Okay, it's this word kavod, which can mean a lot of different things. When we think of glory, we often think of, like a bright shining, and I think that is a part of it, but I think that's not only it. And we're going to see this, associated with the clouds. So we'll see it called the glory cloud at times when Yahweh appears. And he says, "I myself will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim the name of Yahweh before you. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show compassion to whom I will show compassion." He further said, "You cannot see my face, my peneh, for mankind shall not see me and live." And then he promises to place him there, hide him in the rock, and he's going to put his hand over him so that then Yahweh will pass by, and Moses will be allowed to see his back, but my face, my peneh, shall not be seen. Okay, so obviously this is really interesting considering a few earlier accounts we have, right? So Hagar thought that she would die because she had seen Yahweh. She was convinced that the angel of Yahweh she saw was Yahweh, and so it didn't make sense to her that she should live. So she was very, um, I don't know if you could say confused or scared or all of the above and more as well when Jacob, wrestles with the angel, the man, whatever is going on there. Over in Exodus 32, Jacob actually names the place Peniel, for he said, "I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared." Right? And this is obviously at the end of that story when, the man, the angel, whatever, God says, um, that he needs to let him go because the dawn is breaking, right? And he doesn't need to see his face, apparently. And yet says he did see his face and live. So what's going on here, right? Why does it seem like there is kind of this contradiction between can God be seen? Can God not be seen? To what extent can God be seen? What does it mean? What does it mean to see God in the angel of Yahweh? What does it mean to see the face of God? What does it mean to see the back of God? And this is a very complicated picture. And I don't think it's because that these are bad writers who don't know how to articulate a point. I think the point is so grand and so mysterious that it's impossible to fully articulate in the way that we maybe want them to. Moving on, we're going to get into Exodus 34 here shortly. So it's difficult to really read what's happening in Exodus 34, 5 through 7 with a confident and clear understanding of what happened. But it seems to me like there's two Yahweh figures present. Okay. So if we read this, we see Yahweh descended in the cloud and stood there with him. Okay. So again, Yahweh in the cloud. and stood there with him and called upon the name of Yahweh. And Yahweh passed by in front of him and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh, God compassionate and merciful, slow to anger, abounding in faithfulness and truth, keeps faithfulness for thousands, forgives wrongdoing, violation of his law, will by no means leave the guilty unpunished. It says inflicting punishment, I've talked about before, is more literally visiting the sins of the fathers on the children or the sons to the third and the fourth. Again, there's a lot to unpack there. But if we actually go to what's called an interlinear, all right, so if you're not familiar, basically that just means that what they do is they put the Hebrew text right up next to the English text. So we're going to pull up, go to Bible Hub, Exodus 34, interlinear. And I had a link here, but it's not working for some reason. So here we go. All right, so this is Bible Hub. I really like this website for a few things, not as much as I like Step Bible for, but it's really good for their interlinear. So you can read what the Hebrew word is right next to what the English word is, right? So if we go to Exodus 34, and we're going to scroll on down to verse 5. All right, and it says, and descended Yahweh in the cloud and stood, right? It's the same word for and, with him there and proclaimed the name of Yahweh and passed. Right. So in our NASB, they changed one of those where it has and here in this interlinear translation. They had then. All right. So I guess that's kind of the crux of the issue is whether this is happening at the same time, whether Yahweh is standing and passing in front of him, or whether Yahweh stood with him and then stopped standing with him to pass in front of him. And that's where I think the confusion comes in for me. That's where I feel like when I, just look at this text here, it seems like Yahweh stood with him and Yahweh passed by and proclaimed. Okay. So I don't think this is meant to be super clear. And I think that's because this is just something much more complicated than we can really grasp in the first place. So we shouldn't expect it to be extremely clear. So I don't think that should be a huge barrier for us. Now, Yahweh also appeared in Leviticus, but the appearances are a bit different. They're a lot more vague and don't necessarily indicate this human manifestation, right? We've seen human manifestations. We've seen symbol manifestations with the smoke or the cloud and the fire, right? The darkness and the light, if you will. And that's where Yahweh appears. And so it does say that, at the start of Leviticus, that Moses communicated with Yahweh directly at the tent meeting, and others also come before him or in the presence of Yahweh throughout the book. There's little to clarify to what degree there was a tangible manifestation when this occurred and what that may have looked like. Now, when when Aaron made offerings following his consecration, um, and what we're going to see is Moses and Aaron went to the tent of meeting. They came out, blessed the people. The glory of Yahweh appeared to all the people, right? So what is it, the glory of Yahweh? The fire went out from Yahweh and consumed the burnt offering. All right, so this is important. Fire went out from Yahweh and consumed the burnt offering and the portions of fat. And all the people saw it, and they shouted and fell face downward. Now, when you see this Yahweh, fire went out from Yahweh and consumed the burnt offering, you're probably thinking of the story of Elijah when he was on Mount Carmel or Carmel. And, it was this big, Baal or Yahweh, who is the true God. And obviously, Baal never showed up. His offering just sat there, whereas Elijah doused the offering with water. And then Yahweh sent fire from heaven and consumed it. Okay. So that is valid, but that's not the only place that we see this. So I just want you to get that in your mind before we look at some other ones. So Yahweh has fire come out from him, right? The glory of Yahweh appeared to all the people, right? It was the glory that Moses asked to see, and it was all the goodness was to pass, but he could only look at Yahweh's back. So we're gonna continue on here. It's similar in Leviticus 16:12 says that he would appear in the cloud over the Ark of the Covenant, right? So we think of the Ark of the Covenant as perhaps like the footstool of God, right? is not that he is contained by that, obviously, as they found out, but that is a place where he would appear in the cloud over the Ark of the Covenant. Okay. Now, finally, towards the end of Leviticus in 26:11 and 12, he says he would make his dwelling among and again walk among Israel, and it's the same word for walk, halak. Um, so it does imply some kind of personal, localized presence. Would be there among them. So not as much to really clarify things in Leviticus, but it still bears reviewing, in my opinion. Now, as we go on to the book of Numbers, we're going to see several interesting scenes. Okay, so for example, there is the resurrect or the erection of the tabernacle, right? And we see the cloud and the fire being used. We also see Miriam and Aaron speaking out against Moses and something going on there. Again, it doesn't really add to our understanding, so we're not going to spend too much time on those. But during the latter meeting, he also mentions that Moses beholds the form of Yahweh, right? In verse 8. So that's interesting. So apparently he sees Yahweh in some form. He beholds the form of Yahweh. In Numbers, the angel of Yahweh, there's this again. The angel of Yahweh appears before Balaam and his donkey. And now this one is something that we're going to spend some time with. Okay. So during this encounter, it points out that Yahweh opened his eyes to see the angel of Yahweh standing in his way with his sword drawn in his hand. Okay. And so let's go ahead and put that up on your screen here. So 22 through 35. All right, so this is, again, a very well known story, the talking donkey, and that's what a lot of people focus on. But the talking donkey isn't the star of the show. As always, Yahweh is the star of the show. Yahweh is the main character. Yahweh is the hero, and there is no other. So the angel of Yahweh went and stood, right, and a sword in my hand. All right, so Balaam wishes he had a sword in his hand. All right. Then Yahweh opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of Yahweh standing in the way with his sword drawn in his hand. And he bowed all the way to the ground, right? And so that's what Moses did as well. We didn't specifically look at that, but right after in Exodus 34, verse 8, right after the name is spoken, it says, and Moses bowed low to the ground, right? And so that's what is happening here is Balaam is bowing to the ground before this angel. And you would think if this is not Yahweh, he would say, hey, don't bow to me, right? We see that in Revelation when John tries to bow to an angel and he says, oh, no, I'm just an angel. I'm a servant of the Most High. I'm not the Most High. But here he says, or it says that he bowed all the way to the ground. And the angel of Yahweh doesn't redirect that. He just says, why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? I've come out as an adversary, right? So there's a time when Yahweh is going to appear as an adversary because your way was reckless and contrary towards me. But the donkey saw me and turned away. All right. So Balaam again talks to the angel of Yahweh. Right. So this is the angel of Yahweh, but he is bowing to him, and that seems to be acceptable. And this same phrase is actually going to be repeated in a really important place in the book of Joshua, where we're going to get to later on, when there was a man who reports to be the captain of Yahweh's army, and the same phrase with a drawn sword in his hand. And we're going to get to that. So I can go ahead and pull it up for right now just to give you a taste of it, let you start thinking about it. But he even tells him to remove his sandals from his feet, right? This sword drawn in his hand. And you may be thinking, well, what does that matter? But this is how the Bible works, is through textual, what we may call hyperlinks, okay? So if you're willing to ignore textual hyperlinks, then you're not willing to read scripture on its own terms. So that doesn't mean you can just make anything up out of thin air, but I can't think that this is just an accident, right? There was the angel of Yahweh with a drawn sword, and then this is the captain of Yahweh's army, and he has a drawn sword in his hand. And then furthermore, Joshua bows down and is told to remove his sandals from his feet. He's not told not to bow. But anyhow, we're going to cover that more as we move on here, but I was excited about it. So we took a little bit of a segue. Now, in Deuteronomy, you can see here there's much smaller text box. And that's because there is not quite as much going on here. This is mostly words, right? It's Deuteronomy, second law. There's no overtly stated pure appearances of the angel of Yahweh, for example. It mostly focuses on the voice and the words from God. We see references that Yahweh God himself is leading them and will be going to battle with them. And I think that's super important, especially in light of what we just talked about and are about to talk about some more. All right, so Yahweh God himself is leading them and will be going into battle with them. And we're called back to Exodus, where it said that Yahweh is a warrior, Yahweh is his name. All right, so there's maybe a vague reference when it says that when Moses died, he was buried apparently by God. So that's maybe something going on there. Again, does God need to take a human form to bury someone? I don't think so. So we're not going to spend too much time with that. But moving back into Joshua chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. All right, so this is one of the most important theological points going on here, especially to be outside of the Torah. So it specifically references that Joshua approached a man to speak with him. And remember that Abraham had Yahweh appear to him, and it was three men. And apparently, at least one of them was Yahweh. And Joshua recognized him as worthy of worship. He bows down, and he is not told not to do this. He is furthermore told to take his sandals off his feet. The same thing that's said to Moses is to remove the sandals for your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy. Okay. So, what can this mean other than that this man is the angel of Yahweh, who is Yahweh, and Yahweh is the captain of Yahweh's armies, right? And when you think about that phrase, Yahweh is the captain of Yahweh's armies, that's going to tie us deeply into the book of Isaiah, which mostly references Yahweh as Yahweh of armies. And I think this is what's being referred to here is the angel of Yahweh, who here appears as a man with a drawn sword in his hand and accepts, receives worship from Joshua, an act of worship. It seems like it doesn't seem like this is just bowing to a human ruler to give honor to him. And if you did think that, it would be hard to maintain that view, in my opinion, just considering that he is told to remove his sandals from his feet, for where he's standing is holy. And that's the same thing that's said to Moses when he approached the bush, which had the angel of Yahweh. Oh, I'm sorry, God, I am God of your fathers in it. So I don't know how else you can square this other than to think that. But we're going to keep going on with the investigation here because there is more to look at. So if we go to look at the book of Judges, we will see that the angel of Yahweh went from one physical location to another, identified himself as the one. Now, I know some people will say that this is an example of not necessarily the same angel of Yahweh as appeared to Hagar. Maybe this is a human messenger. Again, that could be the case. I have a hard time understanding how that is the case when it says, I brought you up out of Egypt. It just seems like that's not what's going on. Again, that might be the barrier of my context, the barrier of, well, I wouldn't speak that way as a messenger. I would be clear that, hey, this other guy told me to say this, right? He says this, not I say this. And it seems like the way that this messenger of Yahweh is speaking in the first person, it just gets in the way of me being able to read this as him saying this on behalf of God, but himself not, being who he's giving the message for. Again, that could be the case. It may be that I am just struggling with something that ancient people would have not had a problem understanding, right? Again, he did come from one physical location to another, and maybe you think that that's a good reason to think this is a human, but we just saw in the last appearance, Yahweh appeared as a man, right, who received worship. Okay, so I don't think it's crazy that the angel of Yahweh was that same one who is the captain of the Lord's hosts, captain of Yahweh's armies, and he was at Gilgal for whatever reason, and he came up to Bochum. I don't I don't see that as being a problem. That seems just to be a more plain, understandable reading of the text, in my opinion. Again, I'm not a scholar. I'm just some guy. Okay. So, and he continues on, because you have not obeyed me, right? And he continues to speak in the first person, right? And it says, "Now when the angel of Yahweh spoke all these words, people raised their voices and wept. Placing in Bochum, there they sacrificed to Yahweh." Okay, so moving back to the PowerPoint. All right. So, and if we reference Genesis 17, Exodus 20, Leviticus 26, who had done these things, who had made the promises, right? Obviously, that was Yahweh, right? So we talked about the possibility this is a messenger. I don't, I can't square that. Maybe that's what's going on. But again, even if that's what's going on there, it's hard for me to think that's what's going on every time. So, for example, in Judges chapter 6, verses 11 through 27, it says that the angel of Yahweh, again, came and sat under the oak that it was in Ophrah, which belonged to so and whatnot. And the angel of Yahweh appeared to him and said, "Yahweh is with you, mighty warrior." Now, I always think that's funny. Is he really look like a mighty warrior? But again, this idea Yahweh is with you is the same sort of thing that God, Yahweh, said to Moses, right? "I am with you and I will be with you," right? And if we look down in verse 14, sorry, I got that on your screen there. If you look down in verse 14, Yahweh looked at him, right? So the angel of Yahweh appeared, and Yahweh looked at him and said, right, "Go in the strength of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian." So very similar in many ways to Moses' call, which was by the angel of Yahweh, who apparently also is Yahweh, just by a plain reading of the text. All right, it says, "I will be with you, defeat Midian as one man." All right. So then he wants to bring him an offering, and he says, "Okay, sure, I'll wait till you return." Again, same thing as with Abraham when he saw the three men, when Yahweh appeared to him, and it was three men, and he wanted to bring an offering. And here we have Yahweh waiting for this offering, and he lays it on the rock, right? And the angel of Yahweh put out the end of his staff in his hand and touched the meat, the unleavened bread, and fire came up from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread, right? So this reminds me of what we were talking about a few slides ago, where fire came out from the presence of Yahweh to consume the offering, right? So fire came out from Yahweh to consume the offering. Well, now Yahweh brings fire from the rock to consume the offering, right? So I think there's a lot going on there when we talk about what is the rock, right? I don't think that we need to get so fixated on this specific rock in the sense of just the literal stone that this was placed on. But this idea of the rock is a big metaphor that obviously represents um, something much deeper. And we won't get into all that right now. Again, we're going to try to keep this within a few hours if we can. We're already well past an hour. So thank you for staying with me so long, by the way. Um, Okay, so Yahweh had been the one speaking to him. He has fire that comes out. Okay, and then if we are to keep reading here, it says, "I have seen the angel of Yahweh face to face." But Yahweh said to him, "Peace be to you. Do not be afraid. You shall not die." So apparently, Gideon thought he should die because, well, I've seen the angel of Yahweh. I've seen Yahweh face to face, right? Similar to what Hagar's reaction was, right? And they're not the only ones. And it makes sense in light of no one will see me and live, and yet they seem to be seeing Yahweh and living. So again, what is happening here? This is so confusing, right? But notice that where he's speaking to him, the angel of Yahweh had vanished from his sight. So now Yahweh is invisible, and that's when he realizes that that had been the angel of Yahweh. And then he builds an altar. Okay, so Yahweh continues to speak to him without without the visible presence of the angel. So I think that's pretty fascinating. Let me know what you guys think about all that. Um, but yeah, it was only after he disappeared that he recognized what was going on. So that is the appearance to Gideon. There are several more appearances in the book of Judges. So, in particular, we're going to really just focus on one other. I said there were several more. If you were to look into, Samuel's account, he was had the spirit, the ruach of Yahweh rush upon him. So maybe we could look at that. We're not going to just to register that. But in Judges 13, there is one other really significant encounter, and this is Samson's parents, right? So Manoah and his wife, those were Samson's parents. And there is a man of God, but with an awesome appearance, and appears and is referred as a man, as the angel of God, and as the angel of Yahweh. And it's only after the angel ascended in their burnt offering, which what's going on there, only then that Manoah recognized that it was the angel of Yahweh. So similar to Gideon, only at the end, it's, oh, this was the angel of Yahweh we're seeing, and now we are going to die, aren't we? Right? So again, the same line of thinking. Uh, so I've got this pulled up on the screen here. Again, this is Judges chapter 13. In verse 6 is where we have it stated, a woman came and told her husband, saying, the woman told her husband, saying, a man of God came to me. His appearance was appearance like the angel of God, very awesome. So I didn't ask him why he came, or he didn't tell me his name. All right. And made this promise again about what's going to happen regarding her seed. A woman, a seed, a promise. Hey, those are important themes. Um, all right. So this man of God, they asked for this man of God to return. Um, And then, as you know, we're going down, the angel of Yahweh said to him, pay attention to all that I said. Again, right? That's very important, paying attention to all that the angel says, to all that Yahweh says. Okay? And Manoah said to the angel of Yahweh, again, they want him to stay so they can prepare an offering. The same thing that just happened with Gideon, the same thing that Abraham did. Okay? Um, it says, what is your name? So that when your words are fulfilled, we may honor you. But the angel of Yahweh said, why do you ask my name? For it is wonderful, incomprehensible, extraordinary. Right? So that is interesting. So he's like, why do you ask my name, seeing that it is wonderful or incomprehensible or extraordinary, which we have to think back to the name as revealed to Moses, and that seems pretty incomprehensible in some sense and amazing. So wonderful. And then the angel of Yahweh ascended in the flame of the altar, and when they saw it, they fell on their faces to the ground. That same turn of phrase, fell on their faces to the ground, right? They worshiped. Now they realized this was the angel of Yahweh. And they're like, we will certainly die, for we have seen God, right? But, his wife said, no, if Yahweh meant to kill us, he would not have accepted a burnt offering and a grain offering, right? So I think that's really fascinating. That is it for Judges, which is, by the way, again, part of the former prophets. So we are firmly in the Ketuvim now. Could have mentioned that before. We're going to move on to the book of Samuel. In your Bible, it's 1st and 2nd Samuel. We're just going to call it Samuel. It's really one work. So anyhow, in 1st Samuel 3, we have again a word from, oh, I'm sorry, I don't have that on your screen. In 1 Samuel 3, the word from Yahweh was rare in those days, and visions were infrequent. Now, if you remember, one of the first first times that we had seen, this idea of the word of Yahweh associated with a vision was with Abraham, right? And so I think that's something that's being played on here. We're building on that idea that word from Yahweh was rare and visions were infrequent. Okay. And I had a link here. It's not working again. So sorry about that. But then in verse 10, Yahweh stood and called. Okay. So that's interesting. So there's apparently something visible going on there if Yahweh stood and called. Um, and this word stood actually is used exclusively of humans and of Yahweh. So take that for what you will. I can put that up on your screen if you want to see again just a quick search in Step Bible. You can actually look up a term and see where all this appears. And this isn't really used of anything else, just being stationary somewhere, but this is talking about people standing. So take that for what it's worth, if it's worth anything to you. All right. Again, in verse 21 of 1 Samuel 3, it says that Yahweh appeared and Yahweh revealed himself by the word of Yahweh, right? So again, is the word of Yahweh just meant to talk about speech? Because it looks like it implies something visible, because visions are mentioned, right? And Yahweh had stood there, right? So how do you know he stood unless there's something visible? All right, so obviously Yahweh is at work after the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant, but it's not evident that there's any physical manifestations necessarily. So we're not going to spend any time delving into that. In the rest of the Samuel scroll, Only in 2 Samuel 24 does the angel of Yahweh seem to appear, and this is in the context of a plague brought on the people as a form of judgment. Very complicated story, very interesting. I highly recommend the Bible Project podcast, Mountain, episode 6. They have a really good meditation on the story and on what's going on. So, highly recommend you guys check that out. But we are going to move on to Kings, okay? So Yahweh appeared twice to Solomon in a dream. The specifics are not given there, so we're not going to delve in, but just know Yahweh did not stop appearing to people here, okay? And the cloud, again, after the ark was brought into the temple, so they built this temple to, you know, similar purpose as a tabernacle, but now more a permanent home for where, God will be among his people. And again, we see the cloud, right? This idea of the glory cloud. And there's this cloud, but there's also this brightness, okay? And then in First Kings 19, the word of Yahweh came and spoke to Elijah, okay? So I'll go ahead and pull that up because, again, I just think it's interesting anytime we we have the word of God in the Old Testament. Um, Coming and speaking to, right? The word of Yahweh came to him and he said to him, right? So maybe you can interpret this to just mean, well, he heard a disembodied voice. And maybe that's the case, but we've already seen several times, 2 times at least, where it was the word of Yahweh, the word of God, but it was associated with something visible. So there was a vision. So it seems like it is more likely that is what's going on here. But hey, it may not be. So it's not necessary. But I just wanted to point it out in case you feel like that's interesting evidence to look into. Okay. So Micaiah, right, the prophet, he recounted seeing Yahweh on his throne surrounded by angels. Again, this idea of divine counsel I referenced earlier, 1 Kings 22. Okay. So another time when someone is in the presence of Yahweh, seeing Yahweh, right? The angel of Yahweh spoke to Elijah in 2 Kings 1. Hey, did he physically manifest? Not really sure. Um, he again speaks through prophets such as Elisha, a man of God, but it seems like the visions are getting more and more infrequent, and I think that's kind of hinted at with that First Samuel 3. It says visions were infrequent, right? Word of God was rare, visions were infrequent. Um, so what's interesting is in 2 Kings 19, Yahweh is first referenced as the Holy One of Israel. And that is a very important title to get in your brain regarding God, regarding Yahweh. Yahweh is the Holy One of Israel. Okay. So just bear that in mind as we continue to go. Now, there is an interesting story where the angel of Yahweh struck down, again, remember this idea of the angel of Yahweh appearing with a drawn sword in his hand from uh, the Torah and earlier in the prophets, and he struck down 185,500 or 185,000 men. This same story happens in Isaiah 37:36, by the way. So again, we're seeing a lot of consistency, even though visions are getting less frequent. We're seeing a lot of consistency in how Yahweh appears. Okay. Now, if we flip on over to the book of Isaiah, there's a long speech that, again, identifies Yahweh with the title of the Holy One of Israel, as well as the Lord Yahweh of armies and the Mighty One of Israel. Okay. So those are all important titles to know as we are seeking to know God. That is the main purpose here. Throughout the book, most prominently, they use the title Yahweh of armies, right? Or of hosts, Lord of hosts, right? So again, I think that is a direct reference to what was going on with, the angel with a drawn sword in his hand and saying that he is the captain of Yahweh's armies, and he also receives worship. And then here it's Yahweh of armies. So I have a hard time knowing how else you can take that, but maybe that's a me problem. So as we continue on, the Holy One of Israel is also used frequently, but not as frequently. Isaiah 6, Isaiah did see the Lord, whom he calls the King, Yahweh of armies, right? So Yahweh is the king, Yahweh. All right. And there is a prophecy of someone coming to reign on David's throne, prophesied in Isaiah 9, 6 through 7. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I know a lot of people do. I don't I don't necessarily think that it does all the work that some people want it to. It talks about a child being born. Obviously, this is a reference to a prophecy about Jesus being born. He'll be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. You can call somebody by a name that includes God in their name, like Elijah, and that not mean that that person is God. So I don't think that this necessarily is the kill shot. A lot of people think that it is. So I just want to reference that. This is here. This is interesting. But most interesting about this passage to me is that the son is going to be born to be on the throne of David, right? To have a kingdom. But we just talked about that Yahweh is the king. So which is it? Is Yahweh the king, or is this son of David to be the king? Or is it both? Or is there a difference? Okay. And that's going to be a part of what we have to continue to examine as we go on, because we've pretty much already established, we've already answered our primary questions. But again, to be faithful to the investigation, let's continue to look at the rest of the evidence and just see if this remains consistent or if there is a change. I do think that is important. We want to see how consistent our data remains. So, um, you know, we talked about that a little bit. Uh, let's see. So, Yahweh also appears in the books of Jeremiah and Ezekiel on multiple occasions. And again, in Jeremiah 1, we have the word of Yahweh, right? The word of Yahweh came, all right? And not only that, but he actually touched his mouth, right? So, in some physical sense, right, and that's down here in verse 9, Yahweh stretched out his hand and touched my mouth. And Yahweh said to me, behold, I have put my words in your mouth, right? And this was after whom the word of Yahweh came in the days, okay? Now, the word of Yahweh came to me saying, I formed you, right? So I think that's interesting. I don't think you can just pass that by and think that means nothing. Um, Anyhow, so there is again a vision associated with Yahweh. So let's continue. There's not any other physical manifestations for Jeremiah, but that one is significant. Ezekiel saw visions of God, and the word of Yahweh came to him, and the hand or power of Yahweh came upon him. So again, visions of God associated with the word of Yahweh. So it's apparently the word isn't only meant to be audible. All right, it's also something visual happening. All right, so Ezekiel also describes seeing a throne with a figure with the appearance of a man, but he calls this the glory of Yahweh, right? And we talked about before the glory of Yahweh filled the temple and the tabernacle, and it's this idea again of this glory cloud, and there's this cloud, but there's this brightness at the same time. But now he is seeing the glory of Yahweh, and there's the appearance of a man associated with it. So it's not just a cloud, right? And Ezekiel also says the Ruach entered him, lifted him up. Again, that's similar to what's going on with Samson. We didn't talk about that, so we're not going to talk about this. But he did again see a man with the same glorious appearance later in chapter 8, verses 1 through 4, um, with the form of a hand, and the Ruach lifted him up. So that is interesting what's going on there. There is a form of a hand, and then the Spirit lifting him. Okay. And then Ezekiel 11:5 says the ruach of Yahweh fell upon Ezekiel and spoke to him. So does that mean he spoke to him from the inside, or was there a physical outward manifestation? It's unclear. Okay, but again, some similarity, some consistency, and maybe even some development goes on with reference to appearances of Yahweh in Jeremiah and Ezekiel. So moving on to the minor prophets. Yahweh does appear, but it's a lot less frequently. Again, I think that's intentional. But he mostly speaks right through and to prophets, and it's not very clear in explicit detail if he was appearing. Again, the word of Yahweh can come to someone. It seems like most of the time that is indicated that there is a vision associated and it's not only audible, but there's no reason to think it can't be only audible. So we don't know for sure. But Hosea 12:3 through 5. So let's talk about this. I mentioned we would get to it. So This is talking about Jacob. It says he wrestled with the angel and prevailed, and Yahweh, the God of armies, Yahweh is his name. All right. So it seems like this is saying that that story when Jacob wrestled with God, yes, that meant he wrestled with Yahweh God, not just he wrestled with some other Elohim that Yahweh God sent. Okay, so that's my understanding of this. That's what it seems like Hosea is conveying here. Again, if you think I'm wrong, hey, let me know. Maybe I am. Maybe I'm an idiot. I don't know. Amos saw the Lord standing by the altar in Amos 9:1. Not a whole lot of specifics there that we're going to dive into. Zephaniah again calls Yahweh a warrior. And again, it's really hard to see that as just a metaphor now, right? And then, says that he will exalt over you with singing. Okay, so um, we had in the Exodus song that Yahweh is a warrior, Yahweh is his name. We have the angel of Yahweh appearing as a warrior, as the captain of Yahweh's armies. We have the Lord Yahweh of armies, right? We have all these things we have to keep in mind when we want to think about manifestations of Yahweh God. Now, Zechariah 1 has several occurrences of Yahweh speaking. It's difficult to interpret all of these. It says that the word of Yahweh came to the prophet, speaking and apparently telling him what to say. you know, an angel of Yahweh is mentioned. Identity is unclear. Again, it could be another messenger. It's not necessary in the context that it is the angel of Yahweh who we've seen several other times. That could be the case. They could have made that more clear if they wanted that to be the case. They also could have made it more clear that that's not the case. And they didn't. They left it somewhat vague. And so we're just going to swallow that vagueness. Um, the angel of Yahweh also appears in chapter 3 with some ambiguity of identity. So, again, feel free to look these up. I highly recommend it if you want to take a closer look into these things that, I am looking into. I just don't think that it necessarily helps us to look at every verse here. Again, this is already getting around an hour and a half. So, we're going to try to keep this to a reasonable time frame. Now, in chapter 14, I do think this is super significant. So let's go ahead and put that on your screen because it says that Yahweh will stand on the Mount of Olives and that he will be king over all the earth and his name the only one. Okay? All right. So it says, then Yahweh will go forth and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle, right? And we've already seen Yahweh fights on a day of battle, and we've seen him appearing as a man fighting on a day of battle. We've seen him appearing in a cloud and in glory, in brightness, fighting on a day of battle, right? So what exactly is meant here? Well, it says that he will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is Jerusalem on the east, and be split in the middle. Okay. So that's interesting. And how much of that is metaphor? How much of that is literal? It's hard to say with prophecies. It's hard to say many times. Um, but on down, Yahweh will be king over all the earth. And on that day, Yahweh will be the only one, and his name the only one. So it's almost like, well, which is it? Is this son that's going to be born? Is he going to be the king forever? Or is it Yahweh is going to be king forever? And I don't think that they, necessarily want to parse that out and make that super clear for us. And so I think that's intentional. Now, that is it for the Nevi'im. That's the prophets. If I said Ketuvim earlier, my mistake. So that's it for the prophets. That's all we're going to look at there. We're going to move on now to the Ketuvim, which you can tell just by the way I've titled this. They have the fewest appearances of God by far. Again, I think that's intentional that we're getting kind of a dwindling in appearance of Yahweh. Um, I think that's, kind of referenced in First Samuel there, but um, Psalm 34 and 35 references the angel of Yahweh. That's the only time the angel of Yahweh is specifically mentioned, except for First Chronicles 21, which tells the same story as Second Samuel 24. Again, these references are all kind of short enough. It doesn't really bear a specific look for the purposes of this investigation. It doesn't bring anything necessarily new to light. It doesn't contradict anything. If you disagree, let me know. But again, we're not going to be able to look at every single verse in the Bible today. There's anthropomorphic language also used to describe Yahweh. An example in Psalms 18 and Psalm 29. So feel free to look into those. Again, is that anthropomorphism? Um, is that meant metaphorically or is that meant literally? Hey, I'll leave that open. I don't think that is going to make the case one way or the other. Now, in Job 38, Yahweh spoke to Job from the whirlwind, okay, which, if you remember that, Yahweh appeared in the Ruach or in the wind to Adam and Eve after their sin. So he spoke from the whirlwind. So apparently, it's some kind of a manifestation. Not a lot of detail there given. Now, in Daniel, of course, there is a very famous vision which has the Ancient of Days and one like a Son of Man, right? And so obviously that is the title that Jesus most prefers is the Son of Man, based on that he uses that the most to refer to himself. All right. So this idea that there is a Son of Man and he is presented with an everlasting kingdom, right? So apparently this Son of Man is to be the son of David, right? Who's going to reign on David's throne, and he's presented with dominion, honor, a kingdom. People of all nations, of all peoples, nations, languages will serve him. Everlasting dominion will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. Which again brings us back to the same question: which is it? Will Yahweh be king forever? Or is it this human son from David's line that's going to have this everlasting kingdom? Or is it both? Is there a difference in saying those things? And if so, what is that difference? What exactly does it mean about the nature of Yahweh's existence so far as we can perceive it? Is it simply that the way Yahweh is king is that his special anointed son from David's line is king forever on his behalf, ruling in such a faithful way that no one else can, just like, Adam and Eve failed, just like Moses has failed, like David has failed, Solomon, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone has failed. So is it just because that he has anointed this one specifically to be able to do it, that's how he is king? But it seems to me like there is an intentional conflation in images here when we see this sort of thing being said, when we see Yahweh will be king forever and we see the Son will be king forever. And it makes a comprehensive understanding difficult, if not impossible, at this point in the story. And again, how far should we even be capable of seeing from our perspective, right? Because when we consider, the fact that we are existing in the dimension we're existing in, and if we are created by Yahweh, well, obviously He is outside and beyond this mode of existence. So for us to think that we should be able to grasp and comprehend and understand to the nth degree what it means in relation to our existence, what his existence is and looks like, it's, no more than a 2D object trying to understand a 3D, right? If you drew a 3D object on a piece of paper, it doesn't look like a 3D object to a 2D person. It just looks like maybe nonsense, right? So it doesn't really come through. You can't comprehend the axes that you've never experienced. So in that way, I don't think that we should be so high and mighty as to think that we should be, really able to understand Yahweh in all of his fullness, right? How could we, right? If we could do that, then that would seem to imply that he is not actually above us. And he would have to be above us to have created us, right? In the way that he has by speaking us into existence. So I think we're reaching too far if we think we should be able to get a firm, confident, comprehensive grasp. Okay, so this is going to take us now into our summary of findings and implications. All right. So Yahweh undoubtedly is said to have appeared to Abraham, Hagar, Jacob, Moses, and many others throughout the Old Testament scriptures, throughout the Tanakh. And Yahweh frequently appears with images fire, brightness, and cloud or smoke. Right. So whether that's with Abraham, whether that's with the tabernacle and the temple, whether that's at the Exodus event, those are the images that are used time and time and time again, is some kind of fire or brightness and some kind of cloud or smoke. All right. And that's a way that Yahweh appears. But Yahweh also appears in the form of a human figure, which is also called the angel of Yahweh or the angel of God. Right. And there's many other titles, and we're not going to get into all of those right now. But In some instances where we see this language use angel of Yahweh, it is questionable as to whether the figure speaking is Yahweh or is only speaking in the first person as a messenger of Yahweh. Right? So dialogue though from those present, it seems to indicate that they believe they have actually seen Yahweh in a way that's dangerous, considering that no one can see Yahweh and live, and yet someone can, right? So we think about Hagar, we think about Manoah and his wife, we think about Jacob. All of these characters apparently had the understanding who they were seeing was God, was Yahweh, and that's why they didn't understand why they should live after seeing him. If it's just some angel, if it's just some messenger, then they wouldn't be expecting to die necessarily. Right. So that's my understanding of that text. So to me, this highlights an unresolved tension that's going on throughout the Tanakh regarding whether or not Yahweh can be seen by humans. And again, we shouldn't be able to grasp 100% what's going on. I think that would actually detract from the meaning if we could do that. Okay. Now, Yahweh is known to speak both with and without visual appearance, right? So, for example, with Gideon, he was speaking with Gideon with the angel of Yahweh, and then the angel of Yahweh disappeared, and then Yahweh continued to speak with him. Okay, so he is not limited by being present to be able to speak. Okay. Now, when speaking, he frequently alternates between first and third person. And when I initially recorded some of the video where I was discussing that, I was really shocked by it. And I still think it's odd. However, I've done some more research since, and I have found out that this is not as uncommon as I would think it would be. So it happens in other ancient Near East literature where a king or someone will kind of magisterially speak about themselves in the third person and in the first person, even in the same speech. So that doesn't necessarily, imply what I was wanting it to. But I don't think it necessarily needs to in the first place. So um, even without that, considering all the other information that we talked about it, I would really consider the opening questions to be substantiated, right? So we know for certain Yahweh appeared. Yahweh appeared as a human. Yahweh appeared in other forms. Yahweh speaks and acts without appearing. And so it doesn't seem to me like we should in any way think that you can only understand Yahweh as being one person, the Father, and this angel is someone different that's not Yahweh. I don't see where that is supported by the text in the least. Okay, so with that in mind, it makes sense that you need to specify that Yahweh is one because he appears in multiple different forms in different times and acts in different ways. Right, so it would be very easy to interpret that as well. There must be multiple deities who we're worshiping, and so it's very important. No, Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. We are not worshiping multiple deities. It is one deity who is so beyond us, we cannot comprehend the ways that he can act and appear in the world. Okay. Now, considering the unresolved tension as well over, whether he can be seen and what it means, the Tanakh does leave readers with a complex theological mystery that needs resolution, just as it leaves a complex picture that needs resolution with this son of David who's going to come and be the Messiah that no one has been able to live up to. So the Tanakh is a sort of a cliffhanger, it's an unfinished story, both in theological terms and in the literal narrative terms, right? So in the next part of this series, we're going to investigate the New Testament and determine whether and to what extent the tension of these mysteries are resolved in the Messiah or the Christ. That's what that word means, Messiah. Christ means the anointed one, who is Jesus, right? Jesus Christ, Jesus the Messiah. So, and we're going to investigate again whether and to what extent that resolves this theological issue of can God be seen or not? What does it mean? Is God one in a sense that he is one person or that he is what does that mean? How do we even begin to address it? It's difficult. I don't think it's supposed to be easy. So this has been Wayne Bruce with The Meaning Mission. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I know we have gone well over hour and a half, so I really appreciate you sharing so much time with me. Or maybe you just skip to the end and hey, that's great too. I hope you got something out of it. Please let me know. What do you think? Did this help you out? Did this problematize it for you? Did this make you hate my guts? what's going on. Please let me know. I am open to all feedback you guys might have. Really appreciate if you guys would subscribe and interact with my content. I'm really hoping to grow my channel and my ministry. As I've referenced before, in addition to this online content, I spend some volunteer hours with the local Williamson County Jail here in Franklin, Tennessee, as well as a local senior living establishment that I do ministry in. And I'd really like to be able to do this sort of ministry and more on a full time basis. Right now, I am supporting this ministry with a day job. So I would ask that you guys would be praying for me that there would be a change in God's timing, right, for whatever He wants from me. So I'm not going to put on the screen today how you can necessarily support that. I will put my email down. So if you want to email me, if God has put it on your heart that you want to share in abundance to share in this ministry and in this work and walk alongside me, then I want to encourage you to do that if God has so called you. But I'm not, trying to go about this the wrong way. So I'm not sure what the right way is, but I'm trying to fail a little bit less completely. One last time, this is the meaning mission. My mission is to help people like you know Yahweh God in all his creation, because all of the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of Yahweh as the water covers the sea. And this is eternal life, that you know the one true God and Jesus Christ, whom he has sent. And let the one who boasts boast in this, that he knows Yahweh. Thank you so much. Y'all have a wonderfully blessed day. And check out part 2 of Is Jesus God, where we are going to look over all of the New Testament to see what the New Testament authors say. I'm going to put those links up here for you. And I really appreciate, again, you spending so much time with me. Y'all have a good one.